Hey, this is Lee from the Oshkosh Beer blog, and in this video I'm going to showcase a large brewery that stood in Oshkosh, Wisconsin for 75 years. This is going to be a tour of the Oshkosh Brewing Company during its peak years of the 1950s. But before we get inside the brewery, I want to start with some background about how this place came to be. So we have to go back to 1894 when the Oshkosh Brewing Company was created from the merger of the city's three largest breweries. The oldest of these three breweries was the Horn and Schwalm Brooklyn Brewery. This was established in 1865 by German immigrants Leonard Schwalm and August Horn. And it was called the Brooklyn Brewery because it was on the south side of Oshkosh, which was locally known as Brooklyn. This brewery was about 100 yards from the shore of Lake Winnebago. A few blocks south of the Brooklyn Brewery was the Union Brewery. This was built in 1867 and owned by a German immigrant named John Glatz along with his son William. And on the north side of the city there was the Gambrinus Brewery. This was built in 1868 and owned by a Bohemian immigrant named Lorenz Kinzel. So after the 1894 merger of these three breweries, their three separate facilities remained in operation under the banner of the Oshkosh Brewing Company. Here we have a lithograph produced in about 1899, and this presents the three facilities as if they stood shoulder to shoulder. In fact, they were blocks apart. Nothing that looks like this ever existed within the city of Oshkosh. In any case, by 1910, the Oshkosh Brewing Company had outgrown that aging infrastructure. The company enlisted Chicago architect Richard Grieser to design a new brewery. Grieser belonged to a lineage of architects who had initiated a new phase of American brewery architecture, and the new brewery in Oshkosh became an expression of that modern style. The construction began in 1911 on land that was adjacent to the old Horn and Schwalm Brewery on Doty Street, just south of 16th Avenue. That land had been purchased by Leonard Schwalm in 1865 and had been with the brewery ever since. Grieser had designed a classic tower-style brewery that came to loom over the homes in the nearby area. And by April of 1912, the Oshkosh Brewing Company's new brewery was up and running. Okay, the brewery was composed of two main sections, the southern section here and then the northern section here. And those two partitions are bisected by a rail line that ran into the brewery, bringing in bulkier supplies like malt and hops. Here you can see the garage door. This is where that rail line ends. And at the back of the brewery, you can see where it approaches. And here's a look at the back side of the brewery, and you can see how that rail line runs right into the facility. Let's take a look now at the internal composition of the brewery. We'll get into each of these spaces as we go along, but for now I just want to point out the basic layout. Starting here on the southern end of the brewery, the front portion of this section contained the stock room. This is where the beer was fermented and aged. Directly behind the stock room was the racking room. This is where the beer was transferred after it had fermented and aged. Both the stock room and the racking room had cork-lined insulation. And behind the racking room then is the keg washing room. Now, the middle tower here had an elevator that ran up from the railroad track and brought up supplies from the rail line. This section of the brewery also contains storage areas for brewing ingredients and materials used in the brewing process. Now, on the northern part of the brewery, this contained the actual brew house. And then directly behind the brew house was the engine room, and then behind the engine room is the boiler room. This brewery was fired by coal. Okay, let's go inside that engine room where there was this 85 kilowatt high capacity generator. And here we get to see it in action. This was truly the beating heart of the Oshkosh Brewing Company. It powered the entire operation. And now we're looking up onto the second floor of that engine room where there was this 40-ton ice machine. This machine sent refrigeration to the stock room and racking room via almost 12,000 feet of piping. And then just outside the engine room was a 515-foot artesian well that was the source of all the brewing water. The pump house here would pump the water up from the well and then into the brew house. Before we head into the brew house, I need to say something about the beer that was being made here. In the 1950s, the Oshkosh Brewing Company made just 3 beers. 2 of them were seasonal beers. There was a Bock beer that came out in early spring and a holiday beer that was released in early winter. Both of these beers were slightly stronger and darker than the brewery's year-round flagship brand. The main brand was called Chief Oshkosh, and to this day, this is by far the best-selling beer ever produced in the city of Oshkosh. There really wasn't anything special about the Chief Oshkosh recipe. It was about 30% corn grits, 70% malted 6-row barley, and Oregon-grown cluster hops. This was a very common mix of ingredients for an American pale lager. What differentiated Chief Oshkosh from other beers was the process used to brew and ferment it, and that process begins up at the top of the brew house. This was a tower-style brew house that relied on gravity. Each step of the brewing process flowed downward to feed the next operation. The brew day begins up here where the grain mill resided. This is where the malted barley would be crushed into a coarse flour. Unfortunately, the interior photos I have of this area are exceptionally bad, so I'm going to have to resort to diagrams that the brewery included in the 1950s promotional piece. So here you see the grain mill. That slanting ductwork in front of the grain mill was the housing for a conveyor that delivered malt into the mill. The malt was being carried from an adjacent room where there was a large grain bin that had a scale on it. So the malt would be lifted from there and fall into the grain mill and get crushed, and then dropped through a chute that directed it into the mash tun. The cereal cooker was also in this part of the brewery. This was a steam-heated vessel where corn grits would be cooked along with a smaller percentage of malt, and that process created fermentable sugars. Once that cooking was complete, the cereal mash would also then drop down into the mash tun. Below the mill and the cereal cooker was the mash tun. This was on the 4th floor of the brewery. All of the grain would collect in the mash tun and then be blended into hot water to create the mash. This is where wort is created, W-O-R-T. Wort is the sweet liquid, basically sugar water, that later gets boiled before being fermented into beer. Like all the heated vessels in the brewery, the mash tun was steam heated. At the end of the mash, the wort drains through a false bottom in the mash tun and flows down into the copper kettle where the boil begins. You can see the arrangement here. Behind the man standing at the boil kettle, there's a cylindrical device with pipes running into it. This is called a grant. The grant was used to help clarify and regulate the flow of wort from the mash tun and into the underside of the boil kettle. In the kettle, the wort would be boiled for 2 hours. Hops were added during the boil. Here we're seeing the hops. They used whole cone hops, a type known as cluster, grown in the Pacific Northwest. Here's another look at the kettle. This photo was taken about 15 years after the brewery closed. This photo was taken when the brewery was being demolished. Here you can see the full kettle. This was a 250-barrel steam-heated kettle. At the end of the boil, the wort drains from the kettle into the hop jack. This is where the spent hops are filtered out. The wort was then pumped back up to the 5th floor of the brewery, where it collected in a broad steel vessel before it begins flowing back down again. As the wort flowed down, it passed over a series of refrigerated pipes called a Bodlow chiller. As the wort cascades over those pipes, the temperature plunges from over 200 degrees to about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. From the bottom of the chiller, the wort then gets pumped back up and over to the south end of the brewery, where the wort is about to become beer. Here we are in the lab, and what they're doing here is checking the density of the wort to make sure the brew went off as planned. In brewing terms, he's looking for a reading of about 11.5 Plato. This is a beer that after fermentation would attenuate down to about 3 Plato and end up at about 4.5% alcohol by volume. Okay, we're moving over to the south end of the brewery now and into the stockhouse and racking room. This section of the brewery was refrigerated, and this was necessary because Chief Oshkosh was a lager beer fermented at cold temperatures, right around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the recipe for Chief Oshkosh was nothing special. What gave the beer its unique flavor was developed here in the stockhouse during fermentation. There were 27 fermentation tanks in the stockhouse. 15 of them were oak tanks that were open at the top. The other 12 tanks were enclosed steel tanks with glass enamel lining. The different types of tanks would develop different flavors in the beer during fermentation, and at the end of fermentation, which lasted about 12 days, the beers from the different tanks would be blended together to create the flavor that they were trying to achieve. Unfortunately, much of this process was streamlined in the early 1960s, and the Chief Oshkosh beer that was brewed from that time onward was a far less distinctive beer. At the end of fermentation, the young beer was transferred into lagering tanks in the aging cellar. Altogether, the tanks here could hold about 5,000 barrels of beer. These tanks were kept at 36 degrees Fahrenheit. The beer would mature in these tanks for several weeks before moving on to the finishing cellar. In the finishing cellar, the beer would be filtered and then carbonated with CO2 captured during fermentation. Before beer could be packaged, it had to pass through this narrow partition behind the stockhouse. This was the racking room. This room was equipped with metered gauges to determine how much beer had been produced. This was required for taxation purposes. Okay, we're leaving the stockhouse and the racking room now and heading into the washroom. This was directly behind the racking room. Finished beer would be piped from the racking room into the washhouse for kegging. Empty kegs would get delivered here to the washroom dock. Inside the washroom, each keg would get inspected, cleaned, and refilled. The kegs would then go back out the dock and onto trucks to the taverns serving Chief Oshkosh beer. During the 1950s, about 30% of Chief Oshkosh was sold on draft. The remaining 70% was sold in cans and bottles. Bottling and canning took place in what used to be the old Horn and Schwalm Brewery. The beer was pumped there from a trenched pipeline that went from the racking room under the driveway and into the bottle house. The operation would begin with cases of returnable bottles coming in off the dock. Bottles would then be fed into the sterilizer where the labels would be stripped off and the bottles thoroughly cleaned. Those bottles would then get inspected and head into the filler and capper. The Oshkosh Brewing Company had more than 60 workers on its payroll in the 1950s, and although much of the packaging was automated, the packaging operations were still the largest part of the brewery's workforce. Here we're seeing the filled bottles heading into the pasteurizer. The keg beer was not pasteurized, but all of the bottle and canned beer went through pasteurization. Each bottle would then be inspected for proper fill heights, and then the labels were applied. From here, the bottles go into cases. And then into the storage room next to the bottling room. From the beer storage room, the cases would be loaded onto delivery trucks for distribution. Here we're seeing the canning line. This was also in the Bottle House building. The Oshkosh Brewing Company began canning beer in 1949, starting with a Crown Tainer type of can and then going to a cone top. These types of cans could be filled right on the bottling line. In 1955, the brewery converted to a flat top can that required a dedicated canning line. In the mid-1950s, the Oshkosh Brewing Company was the 9th largest brewery in Wisconsin. At that time, the state had 40 breweries. The Oshkosh Brewing Company was among the last of the state's larger breweries to abandon the cone-top can. Only about 15% of the brewery's beer was packaged in cans. The bottling and canning facilities were in the same building as the brewery offices. And in the 1950s, the third generation of Horn, Schwam, and Kinzel family members were running the brewery. This is Lorenz Kinzel, better known as Shorty. He was born in 1900. His grandfather had operated the Gambrinus Brewery prior to the 1894 merger that created the Oshkosh Brewing Company. Shorty was the brewery's treasurer and sales manager. This is Earl Horn. He was born in 1892. His grandfather was co-founder of Horn and Schwalm's Brooklyn Brewery. Earl Horn was the Oshkosh Brewing Company's vice president. And this is Arthur Schwalm, who was born in 1885. His grandfather was the other co-founder of Horn and Schwalm's Brooklyn Brewery. Schwalm was the president of the Oshkosh Brewing Company. During the 1950s, the Oshkosh Brewing Company reached its peak with production of over 60,000 barrels of beer annually. In 1961, the brewery was sold to David Eline. Eline was a member of the family that owned the controlling interest in Schlitz Brewing in Milwaukee. Eline implemented a series of major changes at the Oshkosh Brewing Company. He altered the Chief Oshkosh recipe and process to make production cheaper and faster. The new Chief Oshkosh quickly fell out of favor with its core audience of longtime drinkers. The brewery went into free fall. The Oshkosh Brewing Company closed in 1971. And in 1986, the 75-year-old brewery was demolished.